Okay, so today we're going to work on rule number 2 when it comes to commas, which deals with introductory phrases and clauses. And in order to understand that concept, you also need to understand about what a dependent clause is and what dependent clause markers are. A dependent clause marker is any word that adding it to the start of what would have been a independent sentence turns it into a dependent one. There are lots of dependent clause markers. So unlike the fanboys where there are 7 coordinating conjunctions and all you need to do is learn those 7, unfortunately with dependent clause markers there's lots of them. But the reality is you can recognize them when you see them. And the best way to do that is you take a basic statement like I went to the mall. And you can go up to someone and just say, I went to the mall. And they'll be like, cool, what'd you buy? And you're like, well, I got shoes. And they'll say, that's neat, what kind of shoes? And you can have a conversation right away because you made a complete statement to them and they responded with complete statements and you're off to the races. But if you say something like, because I went to the mall, and you go up to someone and say, because I went to the mall, you get no conversation because they're just waiting and they're looking at you with that expression of eyebrows raised, kind of saying, yeah, what? Because all of a sudden, by adding the word because before your independent sentence, you've turned it into a dependent one. It depends on more information. So because I went to the mall, I got home late. Might be what you say. And so here, you have your dependent clause marker that's turned an otherwise independent sentence, I went to the mall, into a dependent one that now requires a reason for what you're saying, the so what, right? And there are lots of dependent clause markers, unless, until, if, since, because, although. Anytime you can add a word that at the start of a sentence and make it need more information. Although I went to the mall, if I went to the mall, since I went to the mall, you can see how all of those single words turn that independent sentence into one that requires more information. So now you know what a dependent clause marker is, and you know what it does to an otherwise independent sentence. It turns it into a dependent one, right here, right? If your dependent clause comes at the beginning of a sentence, it becomes an introductory clause. It theoretically could be an introductory phrase too. It could even just be an introductory word like however. If it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you put a comma after it. So because I went to the mall, comma, I got home late. If it shows up anywhere else, you leave it alone. And it's as simple as that. So here's our rule again. If the dependent clause comes at the beginning of a sentence, is an introductory clause, then put a comma after it. If you notice, I just did one, right? This is my introductory clause, if being a dependent clause marker. And here's my comma. Right? If the dependent clause comes anywhere else in the sentence, leave it alone. And again, I have another one because if is a dependent clause marker, and we have it there, right? But that last one's important because in all of these you can always move it around. So I could say I got home late because I went to the mall. And in this instance, I'd leave it alone because here's my dependent clause, but it isn't at the beginning of the sentence, it's at the end. And so I'd leave it alone. What that also reveals to us is something important to know about the word because. You should never have a comma before the word because. Do you see it? If this is a dependent clause, and the word because is a dependent clause marker, and you know that if the dependent clause comes anywhere else in the sentence, you don't use a comma, well then there's never going to be a time where you're going to do that. We often make the mistake putting a comma there since the word because often creates sort of a dramatic pause. And so since we have that pause, I got home late because I went to the mall. In your head, you're sort of like, oh, I better put a comma there. But the reality is you have to realize that commas have nothing to do with pauses. They don't have to do with where you took a breath. They are rules. There are places that they go based on function and purpose that are rule-based. And there's really no other, there's never a reason to use them if it doesn't fall into one of the rules. So this is rule number 2, introductory phrases and clauses. If it comes at the beginning and is an introductory clause, then you can put a comma after it. If it comes anywhere else, you leave it alone.